The barking began every morning at sunrise. Neighbors across Maplewood Street had grown used to it, the guttural, angry growl that echoed from behind the tall iron gates of the Carson estate. It was a sound that made even the mailman cross to the opposite side of the road. Inside the mansion, the staff called him Beast. A massive German shepherd with eyes that burned like embers and scars that told stories no one dared to imagine. He had bitten 3 trainers, destroyed 2 kennels, and nearly mauled the veterinarian who tried to sedate him. Nobody could touch him. Nobody even tried anymore. That was until the day Ruth Johnson walked through the gate. She was a middle-aged black woman in her 50s, small in stature but strong in spirit. Her uniform was plain, her smile gentle but sure. She had come to work as a live-in maid for the Carsons, a wealthy family still haunted by grief. Their son, Ethan, had died 2 years earlier in a car accident. He was only 17. And Beast had been his dog. Since the accident, the boy's mother, Margaret Carson, had become withdrawn, her husband buried himself in business, and the once bustling home had turned cold and quiet, except for Beast's growls that filled every morning with pain. When Ruth arrived, the housekeeper pulled her aside, whispering urgently, "Stay clear of the dog. He's dangerous. He's not right since the boy died." Bit the last maid who tried to feed him. Ruth only nodded. Her eyes moved toward the yard, where Beast stood behind the fence, his body trembling, not from rage, but from something deeper. Fear. That night, Ruth stood by her window, watching the dog's shadow move under the moonlight. There was something heartbreakingly human in the way he circled the empty porch where Ethan used to sit. Ruth had seen pain like that before. Not in dogs, but in people. She'd once worked as a nurse's aide in a children's hospice. She knew grief had many faces, sometimes it cried, sometimes it bit, sometimes it barked at the world because it didn't know how else to scream. The next morning, she did something no one else dared. She walked to the gate, a tray in her hands, an old metal bowl filled with chicken broth and rice. Beast was there, waiting, growling low in his throat. "Hey now," Ruth said softly, not stopping. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you, baby. You just hungry, huh?" The gardener yelled from a distance, "Ma'am, don't go near him. He'll tear your arm off." But Ruth kept walking until she was a few feet from the cage. She didn't look him in the eye, she knew enough about pain to know it didn't like being stared at. She placed the bowl on the ground and stepped back. Beast barked once, loud enough to make her heart jump, but then he stopped. He sniffed the bowl, growled again, and then, after a tense pause, began to eat. From the kitchen window, Margaret Carson watched in disbelief. No one, not even her husband, had gotten that close to Beast in 2 years. That night, Ruth cleaned the kitchen, humming quietly to herself, an old gospel tune about grace and healing. Beast's growl didn't echo that evening. Just silence. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret realized she could hear the crickets again. The next morning, Ruth was back at it, same tray, same gentle voice. Beast barked less this time. She didn't rush him. She didn't force anything. She just stood near, speaking softly as if talking to a child. Days turned into weeks. And slowly, the air around the mansion began to change. One afternoon, when Ruth bent down to collect the bowl, Beast pressed his nose against the fence, close enough for her to feel his warm breath on her hand. Her heart caught in her throat. "Good boy," she whispered, smiling through tears. "Ain't nobody bad here, huh? You just miss your boy, don't you?" She didn't know that Margaret was watching again, from behind the curtain, her eyes wet, her hands trembling. That evening, Margaret walked into the kitchen. "Ruth," she said hesitantly. "Yes, ma'am." Why are you doing this? Everyone else is terrified of that animal." Ruth wiped her hands on her apron, turned, and smiled softly. "'Cause he's not an animal, ma'am. He's just a soul that ain't been loved right since his world fell apart." Margaret didn't reply, but her lips trembled. That night, she sat in her son's room for the first time in months. The summer rain came quietly that week, washing the dust off the Carson estate. For the first time in years, the sound of thunder didn't send Beast into a frenzy. He simply sat in his kennel, watching the raindrops slide down the iron bars. Ruth stood by the porch, umbrella in hand, her eyes filled with quiet wonder. "You're getting better, baby," she said softly. "The storm ain't so scary when you know someone's got you covered." She left the umbrella open near his cage before heading back inside. Hours later, when the rain stopped, she found the umbrella lying next to the empty bowl, untouched, but the dog's paw print circled around it like he'd guarded it all night. That was the first sign of trust. In the weeks that followed, Ruth became a quiet rhythm in the household, a presence that carried warmth into every cold corner. She cooked, cleaned, and hummed those same old songs, the ones that seemed to reach places words couldn't. Even Beast began waiting for her, every morning at the same time, by the same gate. The staff noticed the change. "He don't bark anymore," one of the gardeners whispered. "It's like he knows she's coming." Ruth smiled when she overheard it. "Kindness has a smell," she said with a wink. "Once they get a whiff of it, they remember it forever." One afternoon, while cleaning the upstairs hallway, Ruth noticed Margaret standing in front of a closed door. It was Ethan's room, the one that had remained locked since the day of the accident. Margaret turned to her, her voice trembling. "I can't go in there," she whispered. "Every time I try, I see him, his laughter, his sneakers on the floor, his guitar by the window. It's too much." Ruth hesitated, then gently placed a hand over the woman's trembling fingers. "Maybe it's time, ma'am. Maybe he's waiting for you to walk in again." Margaret shook her head. "I can't." Ruth didn't push. She simply nodded, understanding too well the shape of grief that sits in silence and shadows. Later that evening, Ruth brought Beast's bowl closer to the porch. This time, instead of backing away, she sat on the steps with her back turned to him. She spoke softly, more to herself than to him. "You miss your boy, don't you? I had a boy once too. Name was Samuel." Her voice trembled but didn't break. "Lost him to sickness when he was 10. Doctors said it was fast, but Lord, the hurt ain't never been." Beast whined, a low, aching sound that made Ruth close her eyes. "I used to talk to his pillow like it could hear me," she continued. "Then one day, I realized I ain't talkin' to the pillow. I was talkin' to God. And maybe that's what you've been doin' too, huh?" Slowly, she felt something warm against her arm. She turned, and there he was. Beast, his head lowered, his nose pressed gently against her elbow. Ruth froze. Not out of fear, but awe. For the first time, he'd touched someone. That night, Margaret found Ruth sitting quietly in the kitchen, her hands shaking. "Are you all right?" she asked, worry creasing her face. Ruth smiled weakly. "He touched me, ma'am." Beast did. Just leaned in like he'd been waitin' to be forgiven. Margaret sat down, her eyes wide. "You're saying you actually touched him?" Ruth nodded. "And he didn't growl? Didn't bark? Just rested for a bit?" For a long moment, they sat there in silence, two women from very different worlds, bound by the same invisible thread of loss. Then Margaret whispered, would you help me try to go into his room tomorrow?" Ruth reached across the table, her voice soft but firm. "I'll be right beside you, ma'am." The next morning was bright, the kind of morning that seemed to promise second chances. Margaret stood at the door to Ethan's room, her hand trembling on the knob. Ruth stood behind her, humming that same tune, the one that had somehow softened even Beast's heart. When Margaret finally turned the knob, the faint smell of her son's cologne still lingered. Dust particles floated in the sunlight. The room was frozen in time, his books, his jacket, his favorite photo of Beast framed by the bed. Margaret's knees buckled, and she sank onto the chair, tears streaming down her face. Ruth knelt beside her, silent. Sometimes healing doesn't need words, just presence. When Margaret's sobs softened, she whispered, "He loved that dog more than anything." Said Beast understood him in ways no one else could. Ruth looked at the photo, smiling softly. Maybe that's why the dog broke when he left. Sometimes love's too big for the body to hold. Margaret nodded, her tears turning to quiet breaths. Maybe you're right. For the first time, the door to Ethan's room stayed open. That evening, Ruth brought Beast to the porch again, and this time, Margaret followed. Beast stiffened at the sight of her. His ears went flat, his tail lowered. But Ruth knelt beside him and whispered, "It's okay, baby. That's your mama." Something shifted in the dog's eyes. A flicker of recognition. His head tilted. Margaret took a step closer, trembling. "Ethan loved you so much," she whispered through tears. "I'm sorry I couldn't bear to look at you. I'm so sorry." Beast whined again, a sound that cracked the air open. He moved forward, one step, then another, until his head pressed against her knee. Margaret gasped, her hands shaking as she reached out and finally touched him. And just like that, two broken souls found their way back to the same heartbeat. From the kitchen window, the gardener froze mid-step, staring in disbelief. The dog everyone feared was sitting still, head bowed, eyes closed, as the lady of the house cried into his fur. Ruth stood back, watching quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She whispered under her breath, "Love always finds its way home."